A Native American proverb says, "Tell me a fact and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever." This is the story of Charles Darwin, considered to be one of the most influential scientists in the history of the world. To be honest, he was kind of an accidental scientist. He was born in Shrewsbury, England in 1809 to the wealthy Dr. Robert Darwin and his wife Susanna Wedgwood. Darwin's mother died when he was just 8 years old, and for the rest of his upbringing, he was raised by his 3 older sisters, though he did have an older brother, Erasmus. Darwin was not an easy child to raise. He was not good at school, but he read constantly, and he had a strong interest in nature, collecting beetles, insects, bird eggs, and minerals, as well as catching rats and riding horses with his favorite uncle, Josiah Wedgwood. In his journal, Darwin recalls,
"Towards the close of my school life, my brother worked hard at chemistry and made a fair laboratory with proper apparatus in the tool house in the garden, and I was allowed to aid him as a servant in most of his experiments. He made all the gases and many compounds, and I read with care several books on chemistry. The subject interested me greatly, and we often used to go on working till rather late at night. This was the best part of my education at school, for it showed me practically the meaning of experimental science. The fact that we worked at chemistry somehow got known at school, and as it was an unprecedented fact, I was nicknamed Gas."
At age 12, Darwin confessed in a letter that he had only washed his feet once a month at school due to the lack of anything with which to wash. He was eventually kicked out of school at age 15, though it was not because of his smelly feet. Darwin's father, himself a physician, sent young Charles to Edinburgh University with his brother Erasmus to study medicine, but Charles showed no interest in becoming a doctor. In fact, he realized this during a particularly gruesome surgery he was observing on a young girl. At the sight of blood, Darwin ran out of the operating theater, never to return. In addition, he found the lectures quite boring. The elder Darwin exploded in anger and told Charles, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching. You'll be a disgrace to yourself and all of your family." Wow, tough dad, huh? Charles was honest, saying in his journal, "After having spent 2 sessions in Edinburgh, my father perceived, or he'd heard from my sisters, that I did not like the thought of being a physician, so he proposed that I should become a clergyman. He was very properly vehement against my turning an idle sporting man, which then seemed my probable destination." Charles's father was not going to just let him sit around, though Charles thought his father could support him without him having to go to university. Robert Darwin would have none of that and enrolled Charles at Cambridge University. Darwin graduated in 1831 with a degree in divinity, although he later recalled that, "During the 3 years which I spent at Cambridge, my time was wasted, as far as the academical studies were concerned." He never pursued a career in the church. Instead, Darwin became devoted to science while at Cambridge, attending lectures on biology and geology without even being enrolled in classes. His biological work under his mentor, Professor John Henslow, prepared him for a life in science. As a matter of fact, it was Henslow who recommended Darwin to Captain Robert Fitzroy, who was preparing a surveying voyage around the world on the ship HMS Beagle. Fitzroy needed a naturalist as well as a companion. Henslow thought Darwin, who excelled in the sciences, would be the perfect candidate. Darwin's father, Robert, was 100% against the idea and told Charles, "If you can find anyone of common sense whose opinion I value and thinks it's a good idea, I will relent." As usual, Charles deferred to his father's wishes and rode off to visit with his uncle Josiah, 20 miles away, to hunt. When Charles explained the opportunity to his uncle, Josiah quickly agreed to talk to Robert, and with that, Darwin's desire to join the crew of the Beagle became closer to reality. Captain Fitzroy had a horrible temper and almost didn't give the job to Darwin because of the shape of his nose. He believed that you could tell a lot about the character of a person by the shape of their face. Fitzroy didn't like Darwin's nose. However, when the person who was initially promised the job turned it down 5 minutes before Darwin showed up, Fitzroy agreed to take him on as the ship's naturalist. Though the voyage was open-ended, nobody thought that they would be gone for 5 years. Immediately after leaving England, Darwin, who had never spent any time on a ship before, became incredibly seasick, so much so that whenever land was in sight, he convinced the captain to put him to shore to walk. This probably was a good thing, since it allowed him to collect more samples of animals, plants, and fossils than he would have otherwise. On one inland trip lasting 4 months, he rode with gauchos, camped with Spanish bandits, landed in the middle of revolutions, and had to cope with soldiers, Indians, and whizzing bullets. The extraordinary experiences in the rainforests of Brazil, the dry grasslands of Argentina, along the coast of Chile, and high in the Andes shaped the rest of his life and the history of science. During his explorations of inland South America, Darwin discovered many fossils of extinct species. Fossils at this time were explained by theories such as catastrophism. Catastrophism claimed that, every once in a while, animals and plants would be periodically destroyed as a result of natural catastrophes, like floods and landslides, and then replaced by new species created ex nihilo, which means out of nothing. The extinct organisms could then be observed in the fossil record, and their replacements were considered to be immutable, meaning unchanged over time. Darwin spent 5 years circling the globe, and during this time gathered thousands of specimens. The most famous stop in the voyage were the Galapagos Islands, where the Beagle only spent 3 weeks, but it was the most important stop on Darwin's journey to discover the origin of species. It would take almost 25 years for him to pore through all of his notes and specimens and publish his famous book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, in 1859. Darwin's theory, outlined in On the Origin of Species, can be boiled down into what I call Darwin's 4 pillars of natural selection. The first pillar of Darwin's theory is that all species have variation, slight differences in specific traits of an organism. For instance, different sized noses in humans. Darwin's second pillar of natural selection was that more organisms are born than could ever be supported by the available resources and reach reproductive maturity. Therefore, some would live and some would die. The third pillar of Darwin's theory is that the organisms best suited for their environment will survive. And finally, his fourth pillar states that the surviving organisms with the beneficial trait get to reproduce and pass this beneficial trait on to their offspring. Charles Darwin's decision to finally go public and publish his findings was probably forced by a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had also come up with his own version of natural selection. After much negotiation, it was decided that they would both publish their findings jointly, though Wallace allowed Darwin to take the majority of the credit since he had worked out the theory in greater detail. Perhaps Wallace knew the uproar it would cause around the world. Darwin became the target of unending mocking attacks and editorials for the mere suggestion that man had evolved from a lower life form. Over time, science has built up massive and conclusive evidence for evolution, and Darwin has gone down in history as one of the greatest scientific thinkers of all time. Darwin died at his home, Down House, in Kent, England, in 1882. He wanted to be buried in his small church burial ground, saying it was the most peaceful place on earth, but the outcry for a more public funeral and resting place is why today he's buried at Westminster in London.